If you or someone in your family struggles with learning difficulties and you are searching for something to help, then what Tom and his mother went through may sound very familiar. Tom has visual stress, a visual perceptual processing problem. It is not a learning disability or an attention disorder, but it can contribute to learning difficulties. This short film was produced by the researchers and organizations studying and advocating for visual stress in the United Kingdom. But Tom's story is international and timeless. We experienced a similar story in our family, and you may be experiencing something like it in yours. So here's Tom's story.
Meet Tom. He's a cheerful 17-year-old with a passion for sailing, a mum called Sarah, a string of GCSEs, and a desire to get on in life. It all sounds perfect, doesn't it? And yet, intelligent Tom has struggled through school, and from a young age his teachers expected academic failure. And why? Well, you might be guessing he's dyslexic, and you'd be right. But more importantly, Tom has a condition known as Mears-Erlin syndrome, or visual stress. For him, this means the text on a page will multiply in a random, unfocused way, making reading extremely difficult and exhausting.
If you've got a blank piece of paper, imagine having the words on the piece of paper, and then you look at it, and then the original words are there, but you've also got a copy of those words moving around as well on the page. Every time I look at some piece of writing, it becomes highlighted. It becomes, I don't know. It becomes highlighted. It becomes sort of black around the edges, black and sort of white around the edges. It becomes sort of like, whoa! But at the same time, it's out of focus. It's blurred, and it's moving about the page, and you just can't read. And I have to focus. If haven't got my glasses, had to focus 10 minutes, and I was sort of knackered because I'd been putting so much effort into trying to read it.
Once he got to primary school, he found spelling quite difficult. And they used to set spelling tests. He'd come home with homework to learn 10 spellings. And he would find it incredibly difficult, and he would come up with lots of excuses. I did wonder if perhaps he could be short-sighted or long-sighted. I thought it was worth getting that checked out, and they didn't come up with anything at all, in fact. And I had lots of meetings, toing and froing with teachers at his primary school, as to why he wasn't performing as well as a lot of the other children in the class. And basically, I think as a mum, I felt I was in the hand of the professional teacher who would say things like, well, he's a boy, he's a late developer, he's perhaps a bit slow on learning, but it will come as he develops.
I can remember sort of times where like going through a book and not being able to understand it, and I think I can remember just sitting there and crying. You're just sitting there, you're just looking at this book, and it's moving about the page, just sitting there crying.
As you can imagine, Tom's school life didn't start well, tormented by the page in front of him, not understanding why. As hard as he tried, the brick wall didn't move. On top of this, he was getting a reputation for being lazy, not bothering, an underachiever.
I can remember we had to do an English test, and it was something like a spelling test, and we all had to sit down and write, and I remember I couldn't get all these words. I'd go home and practice, and I couldn't remember half the words, and I came back to doing it, and I failed every single question and answer. And I remember my teacher physically ripping up my book and throwing it at me and saying, "This is not good enough. This is useless. You're going to fail in life."
Dr. Ralph Harkness is a leading psychotherapist.
The embarrassment can be tremendous, therefore you act out that embarrassment. You'll do anything to hide that embarrassment. Your behaviour will change. You might become naughty in order to take the attention of the teacher or the parent away from my inability to read or to write, because I just can't.
Once a week you'd end up getting shouted at by a teacher. No, it's very degrading, and makes you feel worthless almost.
By the time Tom went to high school, he and his mum were at their lowest point. It was obvious there was a problem with Tom, but they were still no closer to what that problem was until the family moved to Norfolk with a new local authority.
It was purely by chance. I stumbled across the sensory support service within the education section at the County Council. I booked an appointment to do an assessment of Tom. And I raised the issue. I'm not sure if we're looking at dyslexia or quite what, but there is something going on. And at the end of it, the advisor said that she was very, very concerned, and she thought Tom was suffering from a condition called Mears-Irlen syndrome. But she wasn't absolutely certain and felt that it needed some specialist input, and referred us to Professor Bruce Evans.
Often when I first see the children, they're in their early teens or a bit before that, and the child is often quite hesitant and quite lacking in confidence. And it's important, I think, to try and get in the mind of a child who's struggling at school, who maybe deep down knows that they're intelligent and they can understand what the teacher says, but they have trouble coping with written material. It must be quite demoralising for that person to constantly feel that they're failing when they might be working incredibly hard to try not to fail. And with Tom, it's so great to see him now, because he's such an articulate and obviously capable young man that he comes across as somebody, to me, who's changed hugely over the years.
Visual stress is, in fact, a collection of a group of certain symptoms common to people with reading and spelling problems. Typically, they experience distortion. Letters and words will move and jump around the page. The text might appear out of focus, and often these symptoms lead to eye strain and headaches.
The story really dates back a couple of hundred years when people were using coloured glasses for reading. And they found that reading was more comfortable and less strained with those. But it could only go so far in those days, because in those days glasses were made of glass, and colouring glass is quite difficult. In the 1980s, an American psychologist, Helen Erlen, said that she could treat this condition using plastic tinted lenses, and nearly all glasses these days are made of plastic, which are much easier to tint than glass. And this has really become popular in this country in the last 10-15 years, since Professor Wilkins invented the intuitive colorimeter.
The neurons in the visual part of the brain are firing rather too strongly, causing others to fire inappropriately and giving rise to the perceptual distortions that children see. And what colour does is to reduce the overactivity of these neurons, because all neurons are not only coding the shapes that we see, but also the colours that those shapes have. And there's crosstalk between the shape computation and the colour computation. And the colour in this case is reducing the overactivity of these neurons, enable them to function more appropriately. The colour is very particular. Each individual seems to need their own precise shade, and unless they have that, the distortions are not reduced to the extent that is necessary. Departures from that optimum colour of a very small amount are sufficient to allow the distortions to reoccur. So each individual then has to have their own colour tailored to their needs, and unless it is tailored to their needs, it's not effective.
With Professor Wilkins' invention of the colour remitter, it was now possible to accurately diagnose the exact colour needed to filter out the overactive neurons in the part of the brain governing vision.
What was needed was a research study where a group of people with the condition were given two types of coloured lenses, individually prescribed, so that each child had one colour that should help them and one that shouldn't help them so much. But the children didn't know which was which, and nor did the teachers. Now that sort of research design was something we wanted to do and couldn't do until the intuitive colorimeter was invented, because then that was an instrument that allowed us to do a proper controlled research study.
When I first put them on, as soon as he'd done all the trials and testing, you put the two lenses on, and looking down at the page, you sort of look down and think, how, you sort of had, I kept doing that when he put those trial sort of things on. I was like, That's not right.
I have to say, I sat outside the opticians after the appointment and I just cried because I was so relieved to get a diagnosis. But at the same time, I was horrified because it doesn't come under the NHS and had to pay for it privately. And as a single parent, that was, you know, quite a sum of money to find. But, you know, it's your child, you want to do your best by them, and it was a question of looking at ways of doing that.
The cost of NHS provision would be large, but viewed in the greater context of the expenditure that was currently made on learning support, on the cost to society of individuals who cannot read, the cost to them, their antipathy and subsequent imprisonment very often, I would have thought that the glasses would end up paying for themselves. I mean, they're fairly simple, relatively inexpensive when compared to drugs and other medical interventions. To me, it's a no-brainer. I mean, it makes sense to provide them where they're indicated.
Tom and his mum found themselves with another battle. With money tight, they took it upon themselves to push for NHS help to fund the glasses Tom now needed. After all, if he had had long or short-sighted vision, the funding is there. Tom's MP, the Liberal Democrat health spokesman Norman Lamb, took up their case.
Well, it just seemed an extraordinary case where we have a lad who had been in all sorts of difficulties, hadn't been progressing at school, had been getting into trouble, was seen as a problem by schools successively. And yet, once this diagnosis occurred and he got the glasses, his whole life was transformed. I mean, it was extraordinary. And what impressed me was the fact that his mother and Tom wanted to go out and fight for change to ensure that others who might have this condition got access to testing and the glasses that can make such an enormous difference. We ought to be looking down every avenue to determine why a child is behaving in a particular way. And just having seen the transformation that happened with Tom and the fact that he started to get his qualifications, that he will now be a valued member of society making a massive contribution, it's just so important that all children, irrespective of their income, get the chance to be tested if there is any hint that there might be a problem with their eyesight and with them having this condition.
A problem with visual stress is that a sufferer is often caught between the health and education systems, where neither wishes to take the lead.
You have two different departments saying, no, it's your responsibility, the other saying, no, it's your responsibility, no one actually taking responsibility. And it ought to be possible in this day and age, particularly at the local level, for health and children's services, health and education, to work together to find solutions without worrying about budgets. And I don't really mind too much where the money comes from. I just think there have to be clear protocols that if there is a child in a school where there may be an issue of this sort, then the funding has to be provided, and there just needs to be agreement about how that funding is arranged. Perhaps pooled budgets between health and education would make a real difference here. I also happen to believe that much closer working between health and local authorities at the local level is really important. And you know, it's not just with this condition that you get these problems. It quite often happens where a divide between two organisations with two different budgets actually creates a block to making progress.
Our position is clear. If any child is being held back in their learning, can't get on, can't do the best they can because of any kind of learning difficulty or physical difficulty, then we should step in and do what we can to make sure that they can overcome it so that they can do well. The visual stress is not something which can simply be solved by eyesight correction. Then we need to kind of get deeper into that, see what more we can do, get the experts working together with the parents to see what more we can do so that, like Tom, young people can make progress and get on in school. Well, the NHS says that they do free eye tests for under 16s, and if there is a special correction which is needed through glasses, and that's provided free. But if it's more than that, if there's if there's a greater complexity at the moment which is identified, then we need to make sure we get education and health working together to address those issues. The key thing to do is to make sure that in every part of the country you've got education and health working closely together. And this is a challenge in a number of areas, in speech and language therapy, and making sure we intervene early with all kinds of learning difficulties. But in this area, if there's a problem which requires a combination of health input but also special educational expertise, then we ought to be able to do that and to do it effectively. The issue of visual stress was identified in Jim Rose's report on dyslexia, which he published earlier this summer, which I asked him to do, to look at that particular learning difficulty. And we're going to be training 4,000 extra specialist teachers to get the training they need in dyslexia to be able to then spread their expertise across local communities of schools. And we need to make sure that part of their training is awareness of this issue, the kind of early warning signals and what to do, so that we can get this out there into the community. If children are being held back in their reading or in their learning because of visual stress or other learning difficulties, then we need to make sure they get extra help.
For Tom and his family, the strain of first diagnosing his condition and the subsequent fight for recognition has been hard. It takes strength of character to take on the system.
In any family, if you have a stress, there is the likelihood that that stress will cause a fatigue. When you get a fatigue in metal, there's the likelihood that that metal will give. When that gives, the structure can collapse. There is almost inevitably guilt somewhere other than in the subject's psyche. There might be guilt from mum because she gave birth to this person who has this problem, or it might be dad who thinks, gosh, if only I had, why didn't we notice, why didn't I? And because I'm giving so much attention to this child, am I neglecting the others? And so for me, it's very important that we work systemically with the family and help the family understand that this is not anybody's fault. This is not something to be guilty or frightened about. This is one of those things, and we deal with it, and we de-stress psychologically the visual stress that there is optically.
I suppose it was a bit harder for my sister because the parents were always focusing on me and trying to get my grades up for my GCSEs, for instance. So 2 years trying to focus on me getting my, doing extra revision, doing whatever I could. At the time, I think she understood. She was at the age where she can understand. They're not doing it because I want the attention. They're doing it because if I don't get that help, I'm not going to get anywhere in life.
I really cannot emphasise enough as a parent how important it is to fight for your child, because if you don't, nobody else will.
And that fighting has truly paid off. In the summer of 2008, Tom achieved a remarkable 10 GCSEs, including an A and 3 Bs. And among this great achievement is a C in English, not bad for a person predicted to get straight Fs. Now Tom has gone on to further education, taking a BTEC national diploma with his eyes set firmly on a university place.
He's very steady in the way he deals with you. I've never found Tom to be anything other than entirely straight. There's no sort of mischievous, complicated ways that he deals with people. He's very straightforward, and I feel that I've got a relationship with him where we can talk frankly and honestly, and I really value that, that we can talk about things and he can deal with any criticism or advice in a mature way. So in that respect, it's a triumph really.
Well, from what I understand, it's made a considerable difference to his life. And he's not alone in this. There's a lot of individuals I've seen who describe the lenses as life-changing.
Tom's story is simple. He got to the bottom of the problem, kept persevering, and never gave up. With his visual stress now correctly diagnosed and managed, he can get on with life and go forward to a promising future.